Hi guys, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. Welcome to Grade 3 Lecture 4. Today's topic is raising and beyond. What do I mean by beyond? Well, I mean, let's build a raising range on the flop and then think about how we play that after we get called. You often see coaches cover how to raise flops, but very rarely do they go into the node after our raise has been called and we have to flounder around on the turn out of position in an inflated pot with a pretty sketchy range in some cases. Today we're going to be compartmentalizing our raising game on the flop into 5 bands of hands with which we can raise, and then we'll be looking at how to handle them on the turn after we get action. Let's get into it. The first thing we want to do is map out the 5 constituent parts of any healthy flop check raise range. There are 5 main classes of hand that we want to consider raising a c-bet with. I would think of these hands as eligible. They don't have to raise a c-bet, but they should be considered as candidates. First off, we have a thick value region. These combos are going to be extremely nutted. Their equity is going to be pushing something incredibly high, like 90%, 80% depending on how many draws are available to the opponent on the flop. But overall, these are hands that if they inflate the pot and cause a narrowing effect in the opponent's range, they're still going to be incredibly happy, being entitled to the vast majority of a much bigger pot against a stronger range after we've raised and been called. These hands are typically things like sets, on dry textures, maybe 2 pair, possibly something like a flush or a straight on a wetter texture where more of these hands are possible. Thin value region is going to be in the vicinity of top pair decent kicker, top pair backdoor flush draw, this sort of thing, mediocre overpair to a low board, this type of hand. These are hands that are probably entitled to more 70% of the pot, 75, something of this nature. They may be akin to the tier 2 region that we discussed when we considered making bets. Though the tier system is best used on the turn and river, we can think of these hands when we face a flop c-bet as thin value raises. They will still be ahead when called. They're not mandatory raises anymore though, and the reason for that is that they just don't have as high an investment ceiling, meaning that the eventual amount of money that you want to throw into the pot is not going to be so big that you have to start building necessarily just now. That said, you do want to raise these hands at a certain frequency because by also having thin value raises on the flop, you'll up your overall raise frequency, you'll be allowed to use more bluffs without your strategy becoming over bluffed, and thus you'll be able to disincentivize people from doing things like range betting flops they're not meant to range bet, or just getting too loose with their c-bets. If you don't build enough raises into your flop strategy throughout the 5 regions of your range that we're about to look at, you're going to incentivize your opponents to play a very lazy and profitable range bet strategy, even on boards where a solver would say that that could cost some EV in theory. Thirdly, we have a high EV bluff region. This refers to holdings that have quite a lot of nut potential. The pinnacle of these is obviously stuff like nut flush draws and combo draws, but also things like open-end straight draws and good gutters. Maybe a nut shot, aka a gut shot to the nuts, or something of that nature with good pair draw could also qualify as a high EV bluff. These hands, while they benefit tremendously from fold equity because they get their opponent to fold made hands or ace high, king high that have possibly 40 to 50% equity against them, maybe more, they also do really well when called, and they're going to be entitled to lots of big pots on certain runouts. The reason you want to inflate pots with hands like this is not that it makes your range really weak and really balanced, you do have to use lower EV bluffs as well, but that these hands just perform tremendously well in giant pots due to their ability to leapfrog your opponent's bluff catchers, the overpairs, top pair, etc. by making flushes, straights, etc. on future runouts. These are hands you want to have at a high frequency, but of course you just want to mix these. Unlike the thick value region, the thin value region and the high EV bluff region are usually just going to be mixed between call and raise. You want these hands in both ranges. When you're constructing a raising range against a relatively merged flop betting range, meaning the player is betting a large percentage of their range or is betting mediocre hands at a reasonable frequency, then you're going to also want some hybrid raises. Hybrids derive their EV from all 3 taps in the betting sink, to use the metaphor we introduced in Grade 2 Lecture 6 when we covered reasons for betting or raising. The hybrid region is usually a made hand that is quite vulnerable but has some redraw. Classic examples are things like low pairs with low kickers. While these hands are vulnerable and benefit very much from making their opponent fold what's usually going to be a 2-over card combo, they're also going to have 5 outs to redraw to 2-pair or trips, as well as just get called by some worse hands. There really are elements of everything going on here, and sometimes you can even be making your opponent fold a bigger pair or the same pair with a bigger kicker by raising one of these hands depending on the texture and the pre-flop range versus range matchup. Fifthly, and finally, we have low EV bluffs. These are really important and they're a staple of any healthy flop raising range. A low EV bluff could be something like a naked pair draw with backdoors and overcards. It could be something like a bad gut shot or mediocre gut shot. It could even just be something like an unmade hand with multiple backdoors and undercards to the top pair. Low EV bluffs are essential because they force your opponent to continue much wider. If you were to build a raising range with only the first 3 or 4 groups, what would happen is that your c-betting opponent would actually not be incentivized to continue with any middle-of-the-road bluff catcher type holdings. If they were able to fold all of those hands without being punished, what would happen is that you wouldn't be using enough bad hands to take advantage of that, and your good hands would be massively impacted by getting called at a lesser frequency and thus reducing their EV. All of these things are component parts of a raising range. If I had to say what I think the most common leaks are in range building when it comes to raising flop c-bets in my student community, I would say that people probably don't find enough of boxes 2, 4, or 5. While I think people are quite versed in raising the high EV bluff region and the thick value region, I think people miss thin value bets quite a lot here, thin value raises quite a lot here, as well as hybrids, which often just fall by the wayside, and low EV bluffs, which feel a little bit gross to raise, and you can easily go wrong by succumbing to the better bluffs fallacy, where you're on the flop with some minimal equity hand that would constitute a low EV bluff, let's say 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw, and you decide not to raise it because you could have better hands. These are not better bluffing EV choices. There is no difference between the bluffing EV between a high EV bluff and a low EV bluff, meaning that the difference between raise and call is the same in each case, it's 0. High EV bluffs have higher EV regardless of what they do, and lower EV bluffs have lower EV regardless of what they do. But that's not a reason to prefer Group 3 to Group 5. You should have both in each of your ranges, call and raise. With Group 5, they'll often become so close in EV that they're verging on 0 EV, and in these cases we may even be mixing call, fold, and raise, or even just raise with fold, in cases where the hands don't have enough robustness to call. We have this rough scale of how much of the pot these hands will be entitled to. This is of course not in equity, but in EV. We wouldn't have a hand with 300% equity, that's impossible, but a thick value region hand can easily be entitled to 300% of what starts off as a very small pot and could grow to be a much larger one in future. It's very important to note that we're not fazed by the fact that our low EV bluffs and hybrids are entitled to not very much of the pot. We don't want to be falling victim to the linearization pitfall that we discussed in grade 1 and just raising from the top down, so do remember to include these holdings in your range. As I say, the more thin value region hands you include, the more often you'll be able to include hands like hybrids and low EV bluffs. You don't want to fall into the trap of just being totally unbalanced here and preferring one region to the other based on how these regions feel to raise. The high EV bluffs are only loosely a bluff, just a few notes here at the bottom of this, in the sense that villain commonly folds very significant equity versus the raise. If your opponent's folding 60% equity, I'm willing to call that a bluff, but it's not in the same strong forcing sense that a bluff would be, say, on the river when you're betting with no showdown value. The hybrid region, region number 4, combines reasons, mainly value and extreme denial, meaning that when we get fold equity, because it's still really early in the hand, villain is often folding a hand with quite a lot of equity. The denial is worth a lot more on the flop than it usually would be on the turn. The lower the EV of call and the more useful the fold equity, the closer a hand will get to qualifying as a hybrid raise. That's why we'll often see the lower pairs, which are more vulnerable, with the lower kickers, which make the hand more vulnerable still, choosing to raise as hybrids, whereas things like pocket pairs, second pairs, and low pairs with big kickers will more often prefer call. When it comes to the low EV bluff region, these hands might be plus EV, but in other cases they're just dead on 0. That means that they can mix fold and raise, or sometimes mix all 3 options. We don't want to fold hands that are 0 EV all the time. While we can fold them, we also want to throw these into our bluff raise range sometimes in order to bring down the EV of our raising range, which counterintuitively is actually a good idea because it allows your thick value region and thin value region to gain more EV with no expense because you're not losing anything by raising a low EV bluff. Let's start by going through the thick value region in more detail and take some examples. On unpaired multi-tone textures, meaning not monotone, not all the same suit, there are times when this region must raise. On monotone textures, it doesn't have to, because as we know, flushes do a dreadful job of unblocking calls in your opponent's range and tend to be very slow playable for that reason. Thus on monotone boards, it's just going to be mixed, but on multi-tone textures, there are times when you simply have to fast play your thickest value region. This all comes down to how polarized the C-better's range is, because on a monotone texture, they're going to be very polar, and on a multi-tone texture, they'll be much more merged. You want to raise more urgently against merge ranges because those are richer in mediocre hands which will not be investing as often by aggressing themselves. On paired or monotone textures, this region will almost always be indifferent to calling and raising, since it will push villain towards air with its blockers. I've explained the phenomenon here with respect to monotone textures already, but with paired textures the idea is similar. When you have a pair of 10s on the flop, for example, 10, 10, 3, you're going to be in a situation where having trip 10s is nowhere near as good as having a set on a texture like 10, 4, 3. The 10 will block weaker 10s, which are part of what villain can call your raise with, and villain's range will be more polarized on a paired texture than it will be on an unpaired board. Let's have a look at case A, pure raises on unpaired or multi-tone textures. When we face a range bet, that's the R33, remember this means villain is never checking anything, and we're big blind against button, pocket fours is an absolutely mandatory raise, but furthermore it's a huge EV loss not to raise. Dropping from 322% pot down to 296% pot by slow playing here is going to be a big mistake and something you need to avoid. This is blunder territory. The reason for this is the urgency to inflate the pot and reach the investment ceiling for your hand's equity and EV is actually much higher out of position when you're facing a bet, but it's higher in position when you have the chance to bet. The reason for this phenomenon is that in position, if you check, you'll go straight to the next street, but out of position, if you check, you get the chance to check raise. Thus, it's not so urgent to bet when you are the would-be better. However, when you're facing a bet, should you just call out of position, you will end up procedurally checking the turn to your opponent, and then we can end up on the river with no further pot inflation. This can be a disaster for a hand like fours, which actually unblocks hands that our opponent is going to continue to our raise. Case B is mixed raising on an unpaired or multi-tone texture. This time villain is sized up to B75. The more polarized your opponent's range and the closer they're getting you towards your investment ceiling for your hand through their bet sizing, the less urgent it then becomes for you to raise. Because this more polarized range will consist of more hands that are just folding to the raise anyway, or continuing to value bet or semi-bluff later, you're going to be able to extract just as much EV by calling as raising here, and the EVs are the same. You'll see that I've displayed pocket fours in terms of frequency this time. That's to illustrate the fact that you should still usually raise if you want to concoct a roughly balanced strategy. The idea with this is that you do want to apply a lot of pressure to a C-bet range in general. This allows you to bluff raise more frequently and just makes it less good for your opponent to exploit you by betting too often. In case C, we have a mixed raise on a paired flop. This time we're facing an R33 BB versus BU. Jack 7 is a texture that's quite polarizing, and here the pocket 7s play a very bizarre blocker role. While normally this hand on a multi-tone texture would be a raise, the exception is when the flop is paired like this. What's happening here is that villain's range is incredibly polarized by the pairing of this flop. While the jack is unblocked by our hand, so too are the bluffs in our opponent's range, which are going to be firing future streets at high frequency. What this means is that our hand has polarizing blockers. By blocking the middle of our opponent's range, i.e. the 7, we make less abundant the hands that would only invest by calling and would be likely to check back on the turn. Given that our blockers reduce our opponent's turn check frequency, it becomes much more likely that we continue to face future aggression with this holding, making the hand viable for slow playing even though the opponent has bet a very merged range on a dry texture in a wide range configuration. Note this blocker pattern, it's an important one to remember. Polarizing versus condensing blockers, as we discussed back in lecture 5 of grade 2. Case D concerns raising on monotone textures, and as we can see, even hands as strong as ace-5 here are not going to be pure raising. So we can formulate the rule that on monotone textures, even the thick value hands will mix. On textures that are drier or multi-tone, we're going to see these pure raise, with the exception of some paired textures like Jack 7. That's the rule. As villain sizing goes up, we can say that the hand becomes less of an important raise immediately. Just to fully make sure we understand what's going on in case D, consider the range that you face continues from after you raise here. It's going to be very swayed towards having a club. while pocket pairs like sevens with a club will be pure continues, as will big cards with one club and overpairs with one club. Pairs and unpaired hands with no club will often be folding here. If you think about what's bluffing you later, not all of villain's turn bluffs will contain a club, so you're actually unblocking some of the lowest EV hands in your opponent's range that don't contain a club here that are going to bluff you on the turn. That's right, there are some straight draws and even two big cards like Queen Jack that are going to double barrel turn here, and so you're allowed to slow play the Ace 5 of clubs. There's enough of a source of EV from other avenues that you don't solely have to focus on extracting from second best hands in your opponent's range like you would on a board like Ace 9-4 with bottom set. Let's talk sizing after our raise gets called now. Cobra's rule is the idea that on wet turns, the check raiser will have a big range advantage but will equalize the nut advantage. The idea here is that when you raise the flop, you have a high density of medium and high EV bluffs in your range like flush and straight draws. Therefore, when the turn comes really wet, what's happening here is that you're catching up big time against the made hands on the flop with which your opponent held the monopoly. Your opponent is going to have a lot of overpair, top pair, good kicker, things like this in their range for opening pre, betting the flop, and then calling a raise. And therefore, when you can catch up against all of those hands by turning your high EV bluffs, which is a really combinatorically abundant region of your range, into value hands on a flush or a straight turn, your equity goes up majorly. What's going to happen though is you're going to lose the nut advantage that you gained on the flop by skewing your range towards the high EV strong value hands that were mandatory raises. Therefore, the range advantage is going to be more in your favor now, but your nut advantage that you formerly held is equalized. This is going to cause you to bet frequently on a wet turn, but with a smaller sizing than you would have used on a dry one as the flop raiser. Dry turns give the caller a range advantage because all of the bluffs high EV and low EV tend to brick at a high frequency, promoting the strength of mediocre hands that called flop, such as bluff catchers like one pair, overpair, top pair, good kicker, etc. Therefore, the pre-flop raiser is always going to like it after bet calling the flop when the turn is a brick. That said, the hands that are very strong in your range are going to be even more powerful still. When draws miss, your high EV value hands like sets and two pair are going to become much closer to invincible. That means that you gain a bigger nut advantage now than normal, but your range advantage goes down due to all of your draws bricking. In these cases, you take exactly the opposite rule and you want to go ahead and use a very big sizing, or be a snake in the grass and go for a check raise with your big hands. You want to balance this with some bluffs in each case. On this texture, since we know that nut advantage increases sizing, and range advantage in turn increases frequency, we can expect that spade turns will demand a completely different and inverted strategy to blank turns. Have a look at the heat map here in Pio. This display from the solver shows us how different turns affect our strategy across both magnitude of bet size and frequency for betting our range. If we start by just comparing spades to non-spades, the effect is very stark. While spade turns, as predicted, cause a decrease in nut advantage and therefore lead you to a lower sizing. If you've done the Carrot Poker School's previous grades, you'll know by now that all of the lighter colours, the closer they are to yellow, are going to indicate smaller bets, and the closer we get to purple is going to indicate an increase in bet sizing. So on spade turns, we're literally betting all of our range on every spade, but we're doing so for a B33, the lowest size in our toolkit. This makes perfect sense because our opponent's formerly condensed range has been repolarized by these spade turns. That's going to allow for some raising on their behalf when we bet small, so we don't have to worry about losing value with our good hands in that sense. Moreover, we're not going to hold the nut advantage, so if we do start bombing, we're going to start filtering our opponent quite strongly and suddenly towards spade hands, and even maybe hands like ace king with a spade, kings with a spade, etc. But either way, there's going to be a big dichotomy in villain's range where hands like the ace 3 of clubs begin folding at a very high frequency, and hands like pair plus flush draw and flush begin just pure calling. What that's going to mean is that we don't reduce the EV of villain's hands to zero in an efficient way, because while we may make it unprofitable for villain to defend a hand like queens no spade or ace 7 of hearts, we're not going to be giving ourselves a good price in doing that. On a brick turn, we may have to go very big to make those hands indifferent, and so that's going to be efficient. But on a spade turn, we're simply going to squander extra money when bluffing against the top of our opponent's range, overpaying for the fold equity we get against the bad stuff. When your opponent's range gets polarized, this is the number one GTO effect that you need to be aware of, and it's the main thing that links nut advantage to bet size in GTO. We can observe some other phenomena here as well. Things like a 9 or an ace are particularly bad for us. The reason for this is that we just don't raise those cards very often compared to how often villain bets and then calls with them. Those cards are right up villain's alley, and we can also say that they reduce the combos of 2-pair and sets in our range to some extent, depending on the preflop configuration. A few other things we might want to observe here is which turns can we overbet on and which ones do we just use big bets on. The reason that something like a queen or a king is just a big bet and not an overbet using a less purple shade there is because villain is going to 2-pair up and set up on these turns much more often than we're going to. We 3-bet ace, queen, ace, king, kings, queens pre-flop, we don't call with them, and we wouldn't raise something like queens on the flop even if we had it. Therefore, it's villain that actually becomes a little bit more polarized than previously on those cards, so while they don't have the massive bold effect that the spades have, they do cause our sizing to go down somewhat. Finally, looking at turns on which we go massive, these are going to be things like a 4, on which our hybrids become trips and become incredibly strong. Many of our hybrid raises on this node will be 4, 6, 4, 3, 5, 4, and those hands are going to love that 4. They're going to leapfrog all of the bluff catchers in your opponent's range. Something like a deuce or a 3 or a 5 is also overbettable. Firstly, because you have a monopoly on hands like 5-3 that can make straights on some of those turns, but secondly, because they're largely a brick for your opponent and just preserve the nut advantage of your 2-pair plus region. We can summarize by saying the greater the extent to which your thick value raises from the flop have been preserved on the turn, the bigger your sizing is going to be, but the lower your frequency is going to be because these are going to be bricks that don't help your draw region. The other side of that is that when the turn is wet and it demotes your nut advantage, it's actually going to be really good for your range as a whole, so you want to bet really often and at a high frequency. You could easily get deluded by looking at this heat map into thinking that in spots where you want to bet small, you want to bet often, and in spots where you want to bet big, you want to bet infrequently. This, again, like we saw in grade 2, would be mistaking correlation for cause. Range advantage and nut advantage are separate determining factors to our frequency and sizing respectively, and we need to remember to consider them separately. Sizing doesn't cause frequency, and frequency doesn't cause sizing. They're merely correlated, and you will observe patterns where frequent bets are made more often, but this is because in most spots where we have a big range advantage, we don't have such a big nut advantage. It's correlation. Let's have a look at the Range Explorer now to make sure that we understand how different textures can affect the turn composition of our range in these spots after we've raised flop and then landed on the turn having been called. On a dry 3-tone texture, meaning there are 3 different suits available, we've gone ahead on the left hand side here and raised a range bet on ace 9-4. Villain has continued. On the right, we've raised it on the same flop, but this time the turn has come much more impactfully for ranges shaking things up completely. On the left, what we observe, and obviously here the in position range is the red one and out of position is green, what we see is that the in position range is largely ahead of the out of position range, causing out of position to have to check fold a lot, to give up a lot, and respect the fact that they're at a range disadvantage and out of position. This is going to mean they have to be fairly selective with bluffing, rejecting their lowest EV bluffs, which we'll come to as a rule in a second, and mainly favouring just betting with thick value hands and bluffs that still have a lot of EV. Sadly, for out of position, they're even going to have to check and fold if they face a bet with some flush draws and straight draws on this node. The spot isn't good enough for range and their draws have just diminished in power, so they can't just go betting all the time. What we see on the left-hand picture though is that when it comes to the nutted region, there are a lot more dots in the very high equity and EV vicinities of the out of position range than there are with their counterpart, the in position player. The red range here is struggling to piece together a lot of dots at the very top, although it does have some combos of sets. The out of position range is much more concentrated in these hands because it shifted towards them and not away from them when it raised on the flop. Big nut advantage, no range advantage, bet infrequently, but bet big. On the right hand side we see the complete opposite. The green range is now hugely higher EV than the red one. It's the out of position player that's raised a ton of the flush draws on the flop at a higher concentration, although not a higher pure combinatoric number than the in position player. The big blind is going ahead and filtering towards hands like flush draws on the flop, whereas button is moving towards all different kinds of mediocre hands which have a very strong diluting effect on those flushes. What this means is that the out of position player just gets to the turn with a higher flush density and is able to go ahead and bet more frequently. However, at the very top, it's the in-position player that has a higher density of nut flushes, because these are going to be very often playing as an open pre-flop, but of course big blind will 3-bet a lot of their suited broadways before the flop. What we see here is the inverse of the left. We have a strategy that wants to bet super often, but doesn't have a polarization advantage. If you imagine that the out of position player lost control of their sizing here and decided to go really big, what would happen is that too many of the hands that continued to that big bet in the in position range would be the hands at the far right of the right hand graph. As the range becomes too rich in those combos, it causes the EV and equity in the big blind's range to plummet, and that's really going to hurt the out of position player's prospects. Thus, out of position wants to push this big range advantage but small nut advantage by adopting a small and frequent bet. How do pure value raises react to different turns now? Dry 3-tone textures like this one play in a particularly striking kind of way when we have a pure value raise. It really depends on the turn. Here we have a nut advantage, but villain has a range advantage, so our strategy is to mix check and overbet. Why is the overbet a bit smaller on this node from the B150 that I've been recommending at other points in the Carrot Poker School? It all comes down to SPR. At smaller SPRs like this, there's less pot growth to do in order to reach the investment ceiling, and for that reason, we can choose a smaller overbet that's a bit more normal, keeps the investment level a bit smoother, which is not inherently an important thing, but is more familiar and I think more intuitive to learn as a strategy. Here we can also check though, when we have our pure value raises here, our high EV hands from the flop, we can go for a check raise. The idea is that because our range is now at a big disadvantage, villain will be opening for a small bet or medium sized bet quite often after we check. Thus, the old adage that when you can check raise, you don't have to bet applies here, and we can slow play a few of our really good hands. However, when we have a hand that completely unblocks villain's calling range by not having a 9 or an ace, we're going to go ahead and bet. But you'll note that because we're out of position, even with a nutty hand like this that's entitled to nearly 2 times the pot, there's still not a gigantic EV loss here between betting and checking, only 2% of the pot to be precise. When we have blockers to the calling range and therefore are unblocking more bluffs relatively speaking, we can go for value in a different way and mix some check into our strategy. It's well worth noting the difference there between a hand like pocket fours and a hand like ace 9. On the wet 2-tone turn, villain's range is going to catch up in polarization. We're going to lose our nut advantage, start adopting the smaller bet, just simplifying to B33 here as we said. Our range is merged, it's powerful, but it's not polarized and air heavy like it is on the left. These are just pairs of opposites. So our region 1 hands have now become much thinner value bets. Have a look at the pocket fours. Again, a hand that unblocks a lot of the weaker hands that would call. Undoubtedly, the spade helps you value bet here by removing combos of flushes from your opponent's range, like king 4 or queen 4 suited that button could bet call on the flop. And this hand is now a pure value bet, but if this hand bombs, we can see the problem. It begins to shift our opponent's range a bit too heavily towards really strong hands. One fallacy I would like you guys to reject here is the wording that goes as follows. I often hear students say, if I bet really big with fours, he'll only call me with better. This is an absurd thing to say, and I don't think people realize just how silly it sounds when they say something like this. It really is, as you can tell from my tone, one of my pet peeves. It's not that we don't get called by worse hands here when we overbet, we absolutely do, but we don't want to because we don't get called by enough of them in relation to the better hands that call us. We might even be a favourite against the range that calls us after we overbet, but we're not enough of one to make that a better sizing than a small bet. We'll also get bluff raised sometimes when we go small, but not really when we go big, so it's worth pointing that out as an extra source of EV when we have a flusher set. Another thing I will say about the set here is that part of the value of this hand and part of the reason why it's such a powerful holding is its ability to bolt up on the river. On the 3 flush turn, the fact that you can actually cooler flushes, and I don't really like that word as you guys probably know, but you get what I'm saying. Flushes are going to lose big pots to us often when the board pairs on the river, and the fact that we have those 10 outs to quads or a boat collectively are part and parcel of our value betting function on the turn with this hand. Let's talk now about the thin value region. We'll start on the flop and again have a look at what happens to it on some different turns. Our thin value region is made up of hands with less equity and therefore less urgency to build the pot. If they have a lower investment ceiling, they don't have to inflate the pot as much or approach that ceiling as quickly. Just like if you have to travel a certain amount of distance, you don't have to set off as soon if it's just a small journey. So these hands have a small journey towards the eventual pot size that they crave the build. These combos will always mix call and raise regardless of texture. So when we have a hand like Ace-8 of Hearts on a board like Ace-9-4 against a range bet, we can raise. Another side point that we don't have to care about too much, but is interesting to observe nevertheless, is the idea that you actually want to unblock diamonds, not spades because they're great, but unblock diamonds when you're raising here. A hand like 10-8 of diamonds is not impossible to call. I think it's a bit dicey, but villain could be calling some hands here like king high with diamonds, queen high with diamonds to this raise if it's a small enough sizing in position here. And you actually want that to happen when you have a thin value hand. So having a hand like the Ace-8 of Hearts here is good because you can raise and approach your eventual pot size ceiling, but then you may want to start checking. People often object here and say, I don't want to bloat the pot with this hand. Well, you're not. You're making one raise of a small bet that villain made with all of their range with a high equity hand, and then you're going to start slowing down. As long as you don't go absolutely bananas here and barrel off building a gigantic pot as the aggressor, you're not going to quote unquote overplay a hand like this. The only way you can do that is by continuing to aggress after this bet gets called. Needless to say then, on the turn with this category of hand, we're often going to slow down and start playing our hand for small bets or checks. Range betting, villain must continue loads of weak and merged hands here. If he wasn't range betting, this wouldn't quite be the case. The more of your range you bet in the first place, the weaker the absolute strength of the holding you continue when you face a raise, and the thinner that you can go for value against an opponent who's range betting. Case B, we face the B75, as we know the urgency to start raising is much less now. With King 7, we're not raising here because we think villain can have a lot of flush draws. What we should note is that when villain has Queen 10 or a flush draw, the EV, the pot entitlement between each player, is going to be really close. Flush draws are entitled to a lot of the pot, so we only make an incredibly thin value raise against those hands, and it's not clear who actually does better in EV due to our lack of implied odds relative to our opponents. The real reason this hand raises is twofold. One, we can get called by some weaker hands like Jack X, some weaker draws or floats, or we can also get a bit of equity denial against hands like gutters or Ace X. This hand is going to clearly raise very infrequently because to bloat the raising range full of thin value against a polarized C-bet wouldn't really make sense, and it'd be a very exploitable strategy. If villain knew we were raising these hands all the time, they could really start to construct their betting range in a different way, so they were really ready for this. Mainly, they would just cut back on their low EV bluffs and start just c-betting a stronger range. We would soon end up inflating pots way above and beyond the investment ceiling for the hand's equity in those cases. We have to be a bit careful that if we're not raising a spot in general very often, that's to say we have a low raise global frequency for our range, then hands like this that are kind of mediocre and just on the cusp of being able to raise for thin value and denial are actually going to be raising no more than the global frequency, maybe even a bit less. If you think your range is raising infrequently, these hands will raise just as infrequently as your range. Ace-8 is probably raising around the norm for your range on Ace-9-4, and King 7 is raising about the norm for your range on King-Jack-4. Thin value hands raise at a similar frequency to your range's average global raise frequency. Contrast that to hands like high EV bluffs, even certain low EV bluffs, certain hybrids and thick value hands. A lot of these raise much more often than the global raise frequency for your range. That's worth noting. There's much less raising against the bigger sizing, and our range deploys less raise frequency overall, and therefore we have to be more aware of the fact that it's more sensitive to being overloaded with the wrong type of hand if we lose control of the raise frequency with this sort of combo. In case C, we face a range bet, big blind versus button on the paired board. We can do a lot of raising on this flop, the reason being we just have a lot of value hands that want to raise. We have tons of thick value in the form of trips. We don't have to raise a jack all the time, but we will raise a lot of them. Meanwhile, villain's range is pretty merged when they bet all of their range, though it's less merged than it could be on some other textures. With a hand like 9s here, there's enough of an argument for making a thin value raise. We get useful fold equity, and we have decent equity when called. Again, as long as we don't lose our minds on the turn in the river here, there's nothing wrong with quote-unquote bloating the pot from now with this hand, because we're planning to slow down later. We don't mind investing against bets later, depending on the runout and how good a bluff catcher we have. The only thing we object to is doing loads of betting on future streets ourselves with what will become a mediocre hand. Here, obviously, denial is playing a large role in us wanting to make this raise in the first place. We wouldn't want to raise 9s here if the fold equity was useless. And finally, the monotone texture 10-6-4, we are raising a hand like 6-4 here. This is thin value because of course against flushes we're really dead, and against a hand with a flush draw we're not that far ahead. That in tandem is going to bring down our overall equity when called and reduce this hand to a similar EV raise as raising something like one pair on a multi-tone texture. You don't want to do this very often because again, your overall raise frequency on 10-6-4 is not going to be very high. Your opponent's range is inherently and naturally polarized by the texture, and so if you raise frequently and go too big and build giant pots as the aggressor, you begin shifting your opponent towards hands with clubs and away from hands without clubs. That's why you don't see even the nut flush raising at pure frequency here, and especially not 6-4. Again, this hand is probably raising somewhere around the global raise frequency for range, maybe a bit more, but not much more. I think our range is probably only raising about 7 or 8% or something on this board, maybe less actually. Again, we're removing continues here and unblocking bluffs. It's just really hard on this texture to have a value hand that doesn't block a lot of continuing hands. There's some. You can have a value hand like pocket fours here, which is one of the better ones for unblocking the continues, but even that's not nutted, you know. Monotone boards are really just a different beast altogether. How do thin value hands react now to different turns? On a blank turn, if we raise the pocket nines in this spot, for example, we're going to just have an average strength hand. We do remain far more polarized than the villain does on this turn, because the villain has way more mediocre hands like ace king, ace queen, ace 10, pocket kings, pocket eights, etc. than we do. But villain's range is still fairly polarized given that Jack X is just so much better than all the other regions. Whenever villain has a Jack, they're just going to have a really good hand. Therefore our toolkit is not really going to deploy overbets in the same way that it would in a blank turn in this sort of texture. Here I'd be mixing these two lines, B75 with check, depending on the strength of my hand. As we're thinking about thin value hands for now, pocket nines, given we're not building the block bet, which if you look at the EV would be barely viable, we're not going to be big betting that hand. If we did, we would expect a pretty firm EV loss. In other words, this hand was tier 2/3 on the flop and then it dropped to being tier 4. A tier 4 hand can't invest for value and it's certainly too good to bluff. On a wet turn like the 10, this is quite interesting. So the polarization gap between the two ranges closes, and Cobra's rule said that we should bet smaller when this happens. But this isn't a flush turn. It's not a turn that absolutely nails all of our bluffs, and it's a reasonable turn for a lot of villain's range as well. Therefore, it's not going to be a range bet like the 3 flush turn was in the heat map that we looked at before. And here we're going to be using the smaller sizing due to the closing of the polarization gap that occurs on a turn like a 10, where our Jack X combos, which we moved heavily towards when we raised the flop, have been negated. So we mix B33 with check, and we can expect our opponent with a freshly repolarized range to do some raising here when we bet small, and again, we're not that worried about losing value. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make here is just playing their hand without thinking about the needs of their range in all of these spots. It doesn't really make sense to build a small bet on the left. Your value region is just really strong, and if it's worth betting bigger, although not over betting since the Jack is so prevalent in villain's range too. But on the right hand side, it's not even really worth even building the B75 anymore, and I think B33 is a more sensible option for range. Here, nines actually becomes a hybrid. Hybrid is a bit worse than tier 4. Note how this hand has been degraded here, and when it bets, it can get called by some weaker hands like ace king, ace queen, diamonds. It can get folds from some better hands, possibly. What would those be? I'm not so sure, but it's not unreasonable that villain could have a hand like ace 10 of hearts here, and if we bet large they could fold. I think if we're just using B33, we can't really claim to get folds from better, I don't think. But we can certainly get a lot of denial in this case, like if villain is folding a hand like 2 big cards or whatever, then that's useful. So this hand is like super thin value / denial. It's a mixed bag. In position, we would just check here because check is so much better when you're realizing all of your equity. But I think out of position, it's perfectly reasonable to mix some bet in with this hand because check isn't so great anyway. I think if you're betting big here, you must be getting some folds from stronger hands, some frequency. Our high EV bluff region now is made up of hands with many outs to high equity holdings. These hands aren't really bluffs in the classic sense, and they can have very high pot entitlement. They should be seen as something like a value bluff hybrid, for example, or maybe an extreme denial hand. Case A is where we're facing the range bet on this texture, and we go for a raise 70% of the time. Roughly, it looks like maybe 80% of the time with a hand like Queen 8 of spades. You don't always want to raise this hand. It doesn't gain EV by raising. Its bluffing EV here is 0 because call and bluff have the same pot share. But you do, of course, want to raise this hand at a high frequency to keep the pressure up against this merged range and allow you to raise more often globally. These hands will observe the global raise frequency for your range and they will always raise more than it. Hands entitled to the majority of the pot are value raises. These ones just get very useful fold equity, so you could even see this hand as a thin value raise that gets extremely useful fold equity. That's why you want to raise it at a decent frequency. Case B concerns facing the bigger bet again on the more favourable texture, I guess, for your opponent's range. Villain's going to have a lot of strong hands here, but that doesn't mean that we don't still want to build some kind of raise frequency. Obviously, this hand is going to have a higher raise frequency than our global range raise frequency. Whenever I say global, I just mean the average raise frequency with our range in any given spot. And that's going to be lower here because we're facing the B75. A6 is actually raising really often by raising about 40% of the time if you consider how infrequently the rest of our range will be raising. This hand is raising way more than the mean. In case C, we've actually found a pure raise here in the solver, the 10-9 of hearts. This hand is a little bit frail, it's very nutted, it's got backdoor stuff, it unblocks the dead suit that's betting all the time here because villain is range betting, that's spades by the way, and so it does raise always. Calling is not a giant mistake, it'd be okay to call, but yeah, you should be raising a hand like this at an extremely high frequency because it's combining a frailty, not having showdown value, with a lot of EV and ability to survive in big pots and even thrive and win giant pots sometimes on straight making cards. We should also note that the 10 and the 9 are pair draws here against much of villain's showdown value region like 6s or ace king, and so they're not irrelevant either. We have more raises on paired boards than any other vague texture. Some high EV draws become pure raises under these conditions, so one way to understand what's going on in case C is to just apprehend that your global raise frequency on Jack-7 is much higher than it would be on most other textures, partially because you're facing a range bet from villain, but this is also in part due to the fact that you just have a lot of trips here. It's very easy just to have a random Jack in your hand after you call out of the big blind. The Jack is, after all, a card that's selected pre-flop really frequently, and so just having a lot of natural raises here against what's going to be a really merged range, and you're going to have a more polar range than average on this board. So again, polarization affects how many big sizes you want to use, and raising instead of calling, that choice is to pick a big size instead of a small one. In case D, we face the B33 on the monotone board, and we can see now that we have this high EV bluff, king of clubs, 9 of spades. This hand's only raising about 28% of the time at a guess here, looking at the horizontal bar, but that's loads considering that our range will be single digits here for global frequency. We don't want to raise a lot on a monotone board because there just isn't as much of a polarization advantage here with our strong hands as we have on Jack-7. Moreover, as I say, we're going to be blocking a lot of continues here on this texture, and so this hand, by raising this often, is actually choosing a really aggressive frequency. You do still want to call this hand, you can bluff later. It's okay that you don't have a ton of showdown value right now because you still have the river node to bluff if the board runs out blank. That's okay, you can delay your aggression here, you can do it right away, but because your range mostly wants to delay aggression here and let the opponent continue barreling terrible hands on the turn, then it's correct to slow play this one most of the time, just as you would be doing with the rest of your range. Hands are sensitive to the needs and wants of your range where they're indifferent. If a hand prefers one line to another, it doesn't care what your range wants, it's going to pick the line that's best, but very often on the flop, on polarizing situations, basically case B and case D, where villain has used a big sizing in the former and just has a naturally polarized range in the latter, you just don't want to raise as often. Case A and case C, there'll be a lot more raising and a lot more pure raises in your range. And finally, we can observe that our pot entitlement here, which is about 50% pot, makes this more of a value bluff or a mixed bag of reasons for raising than it does a pure bluff. You can see why humans end up under bluffing when their thought process goes, I want to raise bluffs such as king of clubs, 9 of spades. Where are the lower EV hands? You know, where are the straight draws? Where are the gutters? You need to have some of these too. Let's move on to discuss how high EV bluffs react then to different turns. On the brick turn, we know that we can continue bluffing. We need to have standards here. It's a bad spot for range, so we need to be a little bit nitpicky about what hands we follow through with here. That said, our flush draws or our queen 10 or high EV hands, especially with heart blockers, are still going to feel pretty good about bluffing. But when we suffer this turn card, our range does move into an unfavourable world. So we're going to mix B75 and check here. The only reason we're not overbetting this node is that you'll note that the flop c-bet was already big, so when we raised it, we moved quite hugely towards our investment ceiling, i.e. getting stacks in with a set or two pair already. So we don't really need to worry about going for an overbet at this SPR, though it wouldn't be a mistake either. We have a low betting frequency here globally, which means that even hands like the ace-6 of hearts, they're not going to bet all the time. This hand is an okay check call. It does beat all of your opponent's open-enders, gutters, lower flush draws, most of their bluffs. Therefore, you're going to be able to show down and win, even in some branches where you brick the flush draw. The common mistake here is to see this hand as just a pure draw. That's not what's going on. This is a showdown value bluff catcher, and it's one of the best bluff catchers imaginable with the two hearts. On the wet turn, you're going to do way more betting. We've already seen this, so when you get here with a high EV bluff, you're going to go ahead and bet frequently. Here the solver says, you know what, just don't check anything. This is a really great world for your range big blind. Go ahead and range bet. You can, as we've seen in Cobra's rule, range bet the turn when flushes get there after raising the flop polarized. Here out of position's EV is a whopping 65.48% pot. That's absolutely huge, but it makes perfect sense when you think about all the unique combos of pocket aces, king X, jack X, etc., ace queen in the buttons range that have actually been devalued by this card. What you'll note here is that if we remove the bigger bet just to stay along the same lines that we've already outlined and simplify our strategy to something more familiar and easily implementable, then we don't really lose any EV at all. This drop in EV that we see by removing one of the actions, it's too small to matter and it's only theoretical. In the real world, our range EV will be different anyway, and it's quite possible that our EV is just better with a bigger bet, better with a smaller bet, depending on how our opponent happens to be deviating themselves from an equilibrium strategy. Sometimes both players deviate in a way that just happens to suit one player over the other, and it's not intentional. Humans don't play perfect GTO. That doesn't make learning GTO useless, of course not, or you wouldn't be watching this course, but it does mean that we don't need to care about these tiny little fluctuations and take them as something literal. That's the biggest mistake I see from amateur solver users. They look up an EV and think it directly applies to them. It doesn't. We can simplify this spot to B33 without any sort of headache. I think this is totally fine. Let's move on now to the hybrid region and see what happens to that. Our hybrid region comprises marginal made hands, which tend to share the property that they benefit a lot from fold equity and retain decent equity when their raise is called. One of the sub-reasons for raising a hybrid hand on the flop is value, and some of that value comes from having a made hand already. Other parts of it are actually derived from improving to two-pair trips, backdoor straight, backdoor flush, and winning a big pot there. The more vulnerable these hands are, due to having lower kickers or lower pairs, the more often they will opt to raise relative to the global strategy. Therefore, something like 4-3 is raising a lot more than the global frequency of about 20% because it's a low pair with 5-out redraw with a vulnerable kicker that just means that villains' 2 overcard combos are more abundant. If we had a hand like King 4 of clubs, we wouldn't really be doing much raising here, even against a range bet. And the idea there is that the King is no longer a card we need to fear, but it's actually a card we want villain to stick around and hit with something like King 10. Therefore, we don't benefit as much from fold equity and can quote-unquote slow play our hand. Fold equity is fully denial based here. There's no element of bluffing because upon range betting, you're not even meant to fold a pair here, like pocket 5s is not viable. You can fold 3s or 4s, but the button player is not allowed to fold a bigger pair in this spot. If this was something like under the gun against big blind though, we would see under the gun folding like 6s or 7s here because they'd be much further down their range than they would be on the button. Therefore, this actually becomes a three-way hybrid when you're against an early position player because you're getting value, you're bluffing, and you're getting denial at the same time. All of the taps are flowing in the betting sink. Case B, we face the bigger bet. This time ace 4 is still doing some raising. You'll note that the EV of calling this hand has been reduced to near zero, coming in at only 3.82% pot. The bigger your opponent goes, the worse calling will get, and the closer to a three-way mix a bottom pair type hand will become. If you play a hand like this against UTG or hijack, the hand will be even worse, and you may even start to see some mixes between all three options, raise 4x, call, and fold. This hand unblocks a lot of villains bet folds, so that's one good thing about it. A lot of the mediocre pocket pairs and random cards are not going to be a 4 here. The ace does block some folds, so it's not great, but it is the ace of diamonds, and that's a hand that's going to unblock the most. We wouldn't raise a hand like queen 4 here. This hand is just not as good. It's losing EV by raising because it doesn't have as strong an overcard here. Hitting the ace is much better than hitting the queen because fewer straights are possible on the ace turn than they are on the queen. We wouldn't raise a hand like Queen 4 here against B75, we're just being a bit more selective. I dare say that against a smaller bet, we might actually just be calling Ace 4 and raising hands like 6-4, 5-4 because the calling EV would shoot up a bit more. Case C, we face a R33. This is the board on which we're doing the most raising against range bet because our range is the most polarized on this texture and we have the most thick value hands. Raising deuces makes a lot of sense. Once you see Villain's reaction to this raise, it might look alien at first glance, but Villain is meant to call a ton of unpaired hands here. Again, there is no bluff element to this raise because Villain is not going to be folding anything better than a pair of deuces here, not yet anyway, and so this hand is basically just garnering its EV from value and denial. This hand has an enormous amount of denial because whatever Villain has here when they fold, they're always going to have 2-overs, and then backdoors and front doors, etc. The list goes on. In case D, we face the B33 on the monotone board and we raise a hand like 6-5. What's going on here is again we're benefiting lots from the fold equity because even though Villain is usually folding non-club holdings here, we still get a lot from that when we have a lowly pair with a lowly kicker. Again, the low kicker makes the hand vulnerable enough to hybrid raise. You wouldn't see as much raising with a hand like Jack 6, King 6, Queen 6 in this spot. When we raise a hybrid and land on the turn, it gets tricky because we end up with this hand that's actually quite bad in a spot where our range is mostly polarized, but we have this weird mediocre hand still. Let's have a look at this spot. 10-6-4, Jack comes on the turn, and we've gone ahead and raised something like 6-5. This is a neutral spot for range because the monotone board is just okay for us. It neutralizes a lot of the things right away on the flop. It's not like Ace 7 Deuce Rainbow that's just great for the button. But what happens is that our EV plummets at this point with this hand. This hand is now very far down our range. Hybrids will very often become bluffs on worsening cards for their equity. That's right, because this spot's not bad for your range, you don't just have club X here in straight draws, you can also bluff some weird 5-out hands. And by 5-outs I mean 5-outs against a hand like Kings, or Ace 10 or King Jack, like 6-5. This hand now unblocks a lot of Villain's folding range, and thus, even though it's entitled to almost none of the pot, 3 or 4% to be precise, it plays as a mix between bluffing and checking. This hand has now become a low EV bluff. But beware, there's a difference between a low EV bluff and a no EV bluff. This is a neutral world, you can't bluff anything you want, but having the 5-outs here from the pair and getting some useful fold equity sometimes is going to make this hand okay to bet. On a wetter turn, like the deuce of clubs, this is actually going to be a bit of a tricky one. As we saw previously, 3 flush turns from two-tone flops were very good for the raiser of the flop bet, the out-of-position player I mean. However, in this case, it's going to be the opposite because the button is actually the player who pre-flop just has a massive concentration of offsuit club hands, and other suits too, of course. Having 2 big cards and overpairs with 1 club is usually just going to render the 4 flush turn good for the in-position player. This turn is a disaster for big blind's range of low flushes and lower EV bluffs. We just really suffer in a spot where random big cards become flushes, because button is the person who holds a monopoly on those hands. As this spot is so unfavourable, we really have to behave ourselves in tier 6 and tier 7 bluffs as we outlined in grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School. These are actually going to be unacceptable now. They're going to be slightly better as checks. We have to be so careful here because this is just such a bad world for our range, so again selectivity comes into play. The main rule then with hybrids is that unfavourable turns for your range are decent spots. Where they become weaker, they're going to become bluffs. Where they become stronger, because it's a brick turn, they're probably going to check. And if they become weaker on a horrible spot for range, they may even plummet all the way down to being the bottom of your range and just a give up. Your low EV bluffs are going to start off close to 0 EV on the flop, and they'll be indifferent between the lines of calling, folding and raising, or at least close to that. Some may even be losing calls but break even or winning raises, and it's not unheard of to see a hand like this mixing between fold and raise on the flop. These hands usually have low robustness, but some distant nut potential. For example, a hand like 10-8 of diamonds on Ace 9 for a two-tone is pretty bad, but it can salvage some EV by banking a pair, it can backdoor its way to stuff, it can realise equity by turning a draw which allows it to aggress again instead of check folding, and so this hand just about passes the criteria for being able to raise. You can also call with this hand against a range bet, which might seem counterintuitive, but villain does have to check back a lot of turns at high frequency, and you will have a profitable river bluffing opportunity, as well as a chance to hit pairs and straights, as well as flushes. 2 backdoors alone are barely enough to break even against the range bet. However, this isn't just 2 backdoors, there's also pair draws here. Don't discount the chance of winning by hitting second pair. It's still decent against someone that's betting all of their range. Case B, we have a hand like this. It's now a front door draw, but because villain is polarized and offered such bad pot odds, call is now out of the window. We have the chance to raise or fold here, and as long as we don't raise all of the time, we can build a sensible strategy by mixing this hand in as a bluff from time to time. This hand is raising obscenely frequently compared to the average or global raise frequency for our range as a whole. This illustrates that raise can be better than call in situations where pot odds are bad, we're out of position and so we have less future fold equity, and the hand is frail and not surviving in terms of showdown value. When these 3 things are true, you very often want to raise before you want to call. In case C, a very terrible hand like King 5 of Hearts, just 1 overcard to the 7 only, which is hard. Usually you have 2 overcards to the 7 and it's fine to raise, but this hand's main failing is only having 1 over. That said, it's not an EV loss to raise, or the solver wouldn't ever do it. You can see the solver's raising here about 5% of the time, therefore it's fine, but it's something you don't want to do a lot of, lest you're just going to bloat the air frequency of your range and make it a very exploitable strategy. But a hand like 6-5 of clubs would not actually be raising on this node, and the idea here is that you just don't have enough of a pair draw. You don't even have the second overcard to the 7 now, so you just want to let this one go. 2 naked backdoors with no decent pair draw, usually not enough to raise, even in a situation where your range is doing it a lot. Case D, again the monotone texture, a hand like 8-5. This can raise, but it's incredibly close to break even. It's really not far away from folding, but you want to do this sometimes. You don't want to build the raising range that's too strong, you want to make villain indifferent, and you want to be building in some of these weaker hands as well. Finally, low EV bluffs on the turn. We have this rule called the Judgmental Crow's rule, mainly to help you remember it, but the Judgmental Crow, who's always going to look down upon you for playing badly, says this. First off, having raised the flop, do not bluff again with low EV bluffs that missed a neutral or unfavourable turn card. So if you have the bottom of your range on the flop, your low EV bluffs that are close to 0, and then the spot gets much worse for your range because A, your raise gets called, and B, the turn comes unfavorably, you're going to want to give up because you're running at a deficit of fold equity with nothing going on in your hand. This spot reminds me of turn probe opportunities on boards that favor the preflop raiser, where the big blind just has to give up a lot. The Judgmental Crow says, were you thinking of bluffing just there? Were you? That's a horrible blunder, you idiot. It's not me that's saying this, guys, it's the Judgmental Crow mascot. Beware in these spots. You don't want to keep piling on aggression with absolute air in spots that are horrible for your range. It's just a big no-no in no limit hold'em in general. Here we have a situation where the turn is awful for big blind. Big blind raises flop, turn plays into button's range. There's very few King X combos raising in big blind's range, whereas button's going to have some of them playing this way, and will certainly have the monopoly on hands like King Queen, King Jack of Spades, as well as Ace King and Pocket Kings when we go up to the top of ranges. Here is one of the worst hands we could possibly have. Note how it blocks folding range. Note how it's an unfavorable world in general for big blind's range, and this hand is the pits. Therefore, if we go ahead and bet big with this hand, and note that we would bet big here or overbet probably based on the nut advantage we retain here with pocket fours, ace 9, ace 4, but we're not going to do that with 10-8 because the hand is awful. It has negative removal, as we saw last time. It's removing folding range from our opponent, and it's also just drawing pretty much dead when called. This hand just cannot survive by betting here. This is a horrible, awful blunder. For homework this time, I would like you to look at a couple of spots, big blind versus cutoff, where you've raised a flop bet of B33 and you've been called. Firstly, provide an example of each of the 5 hand classes as they are on the flop. What role does each of the classes now take on the turn, and why? Thirdly, you'll want to do an evaluation of the overall relative polarization and equity of both ranges and how these things affect big blind's turn toolkit. Big blind's toolkit on the turn is going to be the bet sizing that they're simplifying towards and how often they're going to be betting, and that is derivable by thinking about the nut advantage and range advantage of that situation as we did in this class. Finally, can you note an epiphany about a hand class that plays completely differently to what you once thought? How has your understanding of this hand class changed in this spot, and how will you play hands differently now that you've done this lesson? Hand 1 concerns a monotone board with a brick turn, and hand 2 is a more raisable texture, but with a turn that looks at first glance not so great for the raiser, right? King X, really? Are we really raising a lot of that? I don't think so. Have fun with this task, and Feel free to discuss this. If you're part of our Discord group, please feel free to post these homework tasks there and talk about it with your peers. And I'll see you back here for lecture 5 very soon. Thanks, guys. Good luck at the tables, and bye for now.